Good morning. It's 10 o'clock Central Standard Time, March the 24th, 2021. We want to welcome to the Dallas Independent School District's STEM Environmental Education Center, the Rosemont Elementary School. Thank you so much for joining us, and we hope you enjoy the virtual field trip. If there are any teachers who are watching and haven't signed up, please go to www.tiny.cc/EEC register, sign up. This is just for our attendance record only. The program this morning will be factors that affect growth and behavior of living things. During this virtual field trip, students will identify the basic needs of plants and animals and identify factors in the environment, including temperature and precipitation, that affect growth and behavior such as migration, hibernation, and dormancy of living things. Ms. Nash will tell you about the basic needs of plants. Mr. Monroe will cover the basic needs of animals. Ms. Fuller will do a program on environmental factors, and Ms. Ramirez will tell you about behaviors. Now I am going to stop sharing my screen, and Ms. Nash will tell you about the basic needs of plants.
Well, there we are. Hello. Welcome to my classroom, Rosemont. And I went to Rosemont too. So yay, glad to see you. And I know that you guys have a really special garden right near your school, a little nature center, a great place to go take a walk and observe some plants. Because today in my part, we're talking about plants. And plants are really amazing and really interesting. And it's easy to study them because they can't run away. They don't fly away, they don't crawl away, swim away. There they are, and you can study them. And the fun thing to take with you when you go observe some plants is a hand lens, so you can really get a close up in some of the things we're going to talk about today. So plants are pretty amazing, and they make their own food. They don't have to go find food at the store or out in the woods or wherever. They make their food with their leaves, and their leaves get sunlight and they take in air. They don't breathe the way we do, but they have little tiny holes in the leaves that open and close, and they take in the air, and they use the carbon dioxide and they give off the oxygen. It's kind of the opposite of what we do when we take a deep breath. We take in the air and we use the oxygen and we give off the carbon dioxide. So pretty amazing. Now, so the leaf also has these lines in it. So it's something to look at with your hand lens, and they get smaller and smaller. Do you know what those lines are called? Maybe you do. They're called veins. And we have those in our body too. What's in our veins? If you said blood, you'd be right. Now, plants, of course, don't have blood, but they have sap, which is a combination of the water and the sugar that they make in the leaf. And that's what helps the plant grow. Like the blood keeps us alive, the sap and the water keep the plant alive. So those three things are all they need. Say it with me. Sun, air, and water. Sun, air, and water. So stand up. Let's take a little break here. Stand up. Kind of be wrestled back. Okay, now, good. Now stand up and be like a tree. Be tall like a tree. Now, there's three things we need, remember? So water, let's start with water. So pretend that your feet are your roots and they're under the ground and they go out like that all around, and they're going to suck up the water like you suck up milk in a straw. They're going to suck up water with their roots. So lean all the way over and put your hands on the ground and let's suck up some water. Ready? Here we go. And the water goes up to the stem and it goes out to the leaves. And the leaves are going to reach up to the sun. And then they're going to take in the air to get that carbon dioxide and give off the oxygen. So here we go again. Ready? Water, sun, and air. Again. Water, up your step, leaves, sun, and air. Very good. Okay. So I went out in my yard on Sunday and pulled up some plants. Because I've got plenty of these. They're kind of a weed in my yard. And this one, I pulled it up and I knocked most of the dirt, the soil, off the roots. Can you see those roots there? See them? And they get smaller and smaller, kind of the way those veins do, get smaller and smaller. And again, it's a fun thing to look at with your hand lens to see all that neat detail. Okay. And of course, this one, because I pulled it up, it's not getting any water with the roots anymore. And so it's wilting, okay, and dying. But that's okay. There are plenty of those coming up all over my yard. Now, this one I pulled up and I didn't knock the soil off, and it's wilting a little bit too. But it was interesting to see the way the roots were really hanging on to that soil. Okay, they're all through that soil. And that's where they get water and also nutrients. And then this one, I put soil around it in a little pot, and it's doing fine. It'll be fine as long as it gets sun, air, and water. Okay, it'll be just fine. And this time of year is a really great time to go out and see all the beautiful new things happening. So the leaves are just coming out on a lot of the trees, brand new leaves. They're gonna get bigger and bigger, and they're even change color. And then the flowers are starting, okay? We've got the beautiful red buds and these little wild onions. And then this one is a nice one called Precipitation, spiderwort. And you might have this over there in the garden in the nature center. And of course, you probably have this one. It's a cool one called henbit. It's a little weed, but it's cool. But this one you can see. Do you see the pollen, that yellow stuff there? So the flowers are going to be making seeds. So the bees come for nectar, and while they're getting nectar, they get the pollen stuck on their body, and they go to the next flower and they pollinate the plant. And then with the pollen, it can make seeds, and with the seeds, it can make more plants. Now, teachers, if you're interested in doing some plant activities, you can order little peat pots from us and potting soil and all kinds of seeds to plant with your class. Another fun thing to do is to plant the grocery store. Okay, so I've been eating these wonderful mangoes, and you just chew off all the leftovers, okay, from the seeds, and just makes a really attractive little tree, okay, for the house. You can't plant it outside because it won't deal with the cold, but it makes a really pretty tree. And you plant all kinds of things from the grocery store. Avocados are a classic, but the mango makes a really pretty tree also. Okay, so that's all I have for you today. And if you have any questions, I'm sure Dr. Gorman would be glad to answer. And I want to encourage you to go take a walk in the park, in the neighborhood, in that nature center near your school, and observe what's happening with the plants right now. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Ms. Nash. A couple of questions. You have a good definition of the basic needs of plants. And I got this from biggreen.org. That's the source of this definition. Plants, like all living things, have basic needs that must be met for them to survive. These needs include light, air, water, a source of nutrition, space to live and grow, and optimal temperature. And speaking of the optimal temperature, after the spell we just had, what plants would grow at the North Pole? There are approximately 17,000 species of plants that live on the Arctic tundra, including flowering plants, dwarf shrubs, herbs, grasses, mosses, and lichens. The tundra is characterized by permafrost, a layer of soil and partially decomposed organic matter that is frozen year round. So those must be some very tough plants. And now we're going to have Mr. Monroe inform you about the basic needs of animals.
Good morning, students. My name is Mr. Monroe, and we're going to be looking at the basic needs of animals. And boy, I wish you guys were here with us today so that we could go out and take a little exploratory visit to our post oak preserve. And there we would find either evidence of the animals that inhabit the post oak preserve, or we might even see some of the animals. And we know that animals have basic needs, and it may be that your teacher has already talked about those basic needs like food, water, shelter, and space. Very important needs that have to be met because they are considered to be alive, living things. In other words, the science word we use to describe those is the word biotic. And to kind of help you understand a little bit more about this, I'm going to use a very short PowerPoint afterwards. I'm going to get a couple of my favorite animals out and talk about their very special needs, okay? So bear with me while I share my screen with you. Needs of living things. Now, in this little PowerPoint, basically it's going to show you basically what most living things need. Our focus today, or with me during this time, is animals. The 4 basic needs. Living things must satisfy their basic needs for energy. They've got to get that energy from somewhere. Water, living space, and stable internal conditions. Now, you don't see the word shelter, but shelter is involved where you see living space. Also, it does have an impact on their stable or stabilizing their internal conditions. Food is an organism's energy source. Now, Ms. Nash went over plants. You know, plants are considered to be producers, or another word we use to describe plants is that they're autotrophs. They make their own food, okay? Heterotrophs are consumers, are the animals themselves. And you know what? They cannot make their own food. They have to eat something else, all right? Water. They must have H2O to survive. That formula is the formula that represents water. So if anybody ever asks you, what is water? Just tell them H2O. Hydrogen and oxygen mixed together in the right proportion makes that molecule that we call water. You know, it dissolves more chemicals than any other substance on Earth. In fact, 92% of blood is considered to be water. Organisms will survive only a few days without H2O. Living space. You know, all organisms need a place to live, a habitat, a shelter. They obtain food and H2O, and they find, again, shelter. Space on Earth is limited, so organisms must compete. Now, even humans, we're now competing with the animals. And it seems like most of the animals that are in our area are coming up short. I just noticed an area close to the Post Oak Preserve where all the trees were cut down. That's because they're going to start building homes or houses in the area. So what do you think happened to the animals? They probably had to move into the Post Oak Preserve, which is pretty close, okay? Stable internal conditions. Organisms must keep conditions inside their body stable despite environmental changes. And you know, sensitivity to the environment is one quality or one characteristic that living things have. Now, I'm going to stop sharing my screen with you here, and I'm going to get out a couple of animals, and we're going to talk about what their basic needs. I have two favorite animals. In fact, if we were walking on the nature trails today, I would probably be looking for one of these animals. Because here lately, we haven't been seeing very many of them. In fact, what I'm holding right here, and if Teresa will come out, we'll see her. She's kind of coming out, isn't she? Look, she's peeking out. Her name is Teresa. She is a three-toed box turtle. And I can remember when I first started teaching out here, we used to see a lot of these little turtles in the Post Oak Preserve. And I'm thinking that maybe we have visitors coming into the preserve, and what they're doing when they see these little turtles, they're picking them up and taking them home for pets, okay? Now we can see that Teresa has a shell on her back, right? You might consider that part of her shelter. Well, I guess it would be because it does protect her. And there's a science word we use to describe that. We call that an adaptation because it is doing something to help her survive, right? Now, Teresa, or the type of turtle that she is, those turtles that are still out in the wild, guess what? They are very sensitive to environmental changes. In fact, when it gets real cold, like we've had not too long ago, and during the season of winter, these turtles will go into a deep sleep, and Miss Fuller is going to be explaining, or one of the other teachers is going to be explaining that. She will go into hibernation, and she only will come back out when it warms up, okay? So that is Teresa, the three-toed box turtle. Of course, food, she's gotta have food. And I tell you what, one of her favorite foods that grows in the wild are dandelion leaves. She loves those, okay? And she's pretty friendly. She's come out to look at you guys. And she'd like to, I think she's waving at you saying hi, okay? Now, one of my other favorite animals come from a different place. You know, there are different places that animals live all over our world. And conditions have to be just right for them to maintain that internal temperature that they usually are normal. I mean, that's normal to them. Now, the animal that I'm going to get out next comes from an aquatic system. You see, we have several studies out here. We'll either take students on a Post Oak Preserve nature trail hike to study that ecosystem, or we will go and study the pond. Well, this animal comes from the pond. And this is Hoppy the Bullfrog. Yes, he's a real live bullfrog, and I've had him for a while. He's quite large too, isn't he? Now, Hoppy is a little different type of animal. So his basic needs still are going to be food, water, shelter, and space. Don't want to get a bunch of these guys crowded up because the food shortage there will be a food shortage, okay? And guess what? He has to have food. And you know what his favorite food is? Bugs and insects. He just loves to eat bugs and insects, okay? And he can do very well in catching them, can't you, Hoppy? Now, if he was to get loose, boy, he'd be hopping all over this place. That's why I gave him the name Hoppy. And as far as water is concerned, I found out that once a frog grows to this point, his skin has to be kept moist, because that's one way that they obtain some of the oxygen through their skin to help them live, to maintain that internal balance of making the conditions inside his body be stable, okay? So there are a lot of things that are involved as far as fulfilling or the animal getting what it needs to stay alive. Food, water, shelter, and space are the basic needs of animals. Hopefully I've been able to help you understand the basic needs of animals. I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Gorman, and maybe if any of you have any questions, maybe he can answer those for you.
Okay, Mr. Monroe, thank you so much for that program. And the question is, what happens if the animal does not have these basic necessities? And I'm going to sciencing.org, In order to survive, an organism requires nutrition, water, oxygen, habitat, and proper temperature. A lack of any of these fundamental necessities proves detrimental to an animal's survival at most. In other words, it could die, and its growth and development at the very least. It might be skinny, he might be, sick and all if he doesn't have these necessities. And now we're going to have Miss Fuller tell us about environmental factors.
Good morning, boys and girls. My name is Mrs. Fuller. Welcome to my laboratory. And this is my lab assistant. This is Spring. Spring is a ball python. She's really fascinated by the light behind the computer. Spring is a sub-Saharan from Africa organism. And Spring does something, well, Spring's relatives, not Spring, because she's here in Texas, but her relatives who still live in Africa do something very interesting during the dry season when there's not enough precipitation, not enough rain. They go deep into the ground in a hole, and they do something called estivation. Now, the Latin word for summer is estus. So what they do is they go into a dormant stage or a resting stage during the summer, during the estus. And that's contrasted to hibernation. So I'm going to put her down and I'm going to talk to you about the environmental factors in an ecosystem that cause these different behaviors in animals. Let me put her down. She doesn't want to be put down. She want to wrap around my wrist. Let me go ahead and share my screen with you. All right. So the title of this segment is Abiotic Factors That Affect Growth and Behavior in Living Things. And this is basically about how or what provokes hibernation, estivation, migration, and other living aspects. So what we're going to be talking about are the non-living factors in an ecosystem. Those are called abiotic. A means without, bio means life. So these are the factors in an ecosystem that are not alive and have never been alive. And those include a huge amount of factors, but some of the really big ones are things like temperature and humidity and precipitation, sunlight, wind, water, minerals in the soil. All of these things are abiotic factors. So any of those two would fill that answer of what are two abiotic factors in an ecosystem. My snake is escaping. Let's talk first about temperature, since that's what we mentioned about, no, I think that's what Mr. Monroe mentioned when he was talking about Teresa the turtle and how that she hibernates because of temperature. This is a little plant. It's called a snowdrop. They grow in colder climates than we have here in Texas, but they actually start coming up out of the ground while the snow is still on the ground. It's a European plant. It's not a native North American plant. And snakes out again. They begin growing in January or February, and they push up through the snow, and that's how they got their name snowdrop. And they flower before the other flowers that we associate with spring, things like daffodils. They are a member of the amaryllis family, but are stimulated by change in temperature. Now, what about the amount of sunlight? The sun's an abiotic factor, provides heat and light for the earth. Well, migration of birds is usually stimulated or caused by the amount of sunlight in a day. That's a seasonal change, and a big change in temperature can cause the migration to start earlier. So this is a whooping crane. This is a very famous Texas bird They spend the winter here down in Matagorda Bay, well, Aransas Pass, actually. And they're very rare and not too many left, but they migrate from far north and spend the winters with us. Now, what about temperature and hibernation? The Latin word for winter is hibernus. So in the wintertime, many animals, not just Teresa the turtle, but bears and all the other kinds of animals, you'll learn about some more in the next segment, hibernate. Because the word hibernation comes from hibernus, that tells us this is a resting state they go into in the winter time. Now, bears will start their hibernation when the ambient air temperature reaches 0 degrees Celsius. And that's when they enter their den. And then they lie down, they go into a deep sleep, and their metabolism slows way down. It's not a temperature change, however, that wakes them up. It's a metabolic change within their bodies. But temperature is an abiotic factor, and that is the spark that causes them to start denning. Okay. Now, precipitation. We talked about our little friend Spring here, and that in her environment in Africa, when there's not enough precipitation, and of course that lack of precipitation also affects her food source. These ball pythons eat a lot of gerbils. Well, she'll go in and go into estivation. In rain or the lack thereof can cause changes in activities in animals. Water is necessary for life, so they must protect themselves against the lack of water or too much water. Now you see a little toad here to the left, to the right. Like Mr. Monroe pointed out with Hoppy the Bullfrog, amphibians, with toads and frogs are amphibians, they must stay moist because they've got an ineffective heart. Their heart only has 3 chambers, and so they are dependent on their skin to help them with a gas exchange. So they've got to stay moist, and if there's not enough rain, they have to dig deep in the ground to protect themselves from the lack of rain. Now, how does precipitation help ecosystems? They have to have some water because plants and animals are dependent on water to stay alive. Water is non-living, it's abiotic, but it's crucial for life. And water can enter the ecosystem through precipitation, rain, snow, sleet, or hail, from groundwater or from rivers. Even in a desert, animals must have water. So let me stop sharing my screen with you. And I'm going to talk real quickly. I've brought her back up. She would not stay in her cage. But you can see how changes in the abiotic factors in the ecosystem, the ones that are not alive, how that they can profoundly affect the organisms, the plants and animals in the ecosystem. If you have any questions about abiotic factors, Dr. Gorman will be more than happy to answer them. I hope you have a delightful day. Thank you so much. Good day.
Thank you, Ms. Fuller. And Dylan from Rosemont asked the question, who is Teresa? Mr. Monroe brought out his box turtle. That's kind of a pet for him, and he also uses it as a teaching aid. And that box turtle is Teresa, 3-toed box turtle. I believe they actually collected that turtle from the Postal Preserve here at the center. Thank you again, Dylan and Mr. Monroe. And now we're going to have Ms. Ramirez tell us about the behaviors of animals, or behaviors.
Hello, my name is Ms. Ramirez, and in this segment, we're going to be looking at more examples of animals that undergo certain behaviors during environmental changes. So before we start our PowerPoint presentation, I just want to show you guys a couple little things that I have in my room. So the first things I'm going to show you guys are some pelts. As I show you these animals, be thinking about how do you think these animals change their behavior in response to different environmental conditions. So this animal, it's not alive anymore, but this is what's called a pelt. And a pelt is simply an animal's fur, its thin skin, so you can see that. And this animal happens to be a raccoon. So this is a raccoon pelt. And for those of you that might not be familiar with what a raccoon looks like, those are those nocturnal animals that you might see outside around garbage cans, or they're very common in a city. They eat just about anything. They have that little mask look on their face and the little striped tail. And then my other pelt that I have for you guys is this one here. Hopefully you guys are able to tell what it is. Lucky for you guys, this animal's not alive anymore either. Again, it's a pelt, but this is a skunk. So they're actually pretty soft. So think about how these animals change their behaviors in response to different environmental conditions. So that's their skunk. And then my last one is just a pretty Riker mount of different beautiful butterflies. So think about what behaviors do butterflies go through as environmental changes occur. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you guys, and we'll start our presentation. So today we're going to be focusing on those behaviors and examples of animals that undergo those particular behaviors. So hopefully by the end of today's presentation, you'll be able to answer my two essential questions. My first question is, you should be able to list and describe 2 ways animals and or plants change their behavior in response to environmental factors. The second question you guys should be able to answer is, you should be able to list 2 ways animals prepare themselves for migration. So before we get started, I have just a little poem for you guys, and it just goes over a brief overview of some of these behaviors that animals can do in the winter time. So bears are sleeping in a cave. Groundhogs are burrowed underground. Animals hibernate in winter time, breathing slowly, not making a sound. So that's hibernation. Then birds are flying across the sky. Fish are swimming deep in the sea. Animals migrate in winter time, searching for food and a warm place to be. So think about that word migration. Hares are camouflaging in the snow. Foxes are nice and thick with their fur. Animals adapt in winter time, collecting, hiding, each with their own trick. So those are some examples of ways animals have adapted for the cold. Not only can animals change their behaviors in response to cold temperatures, but also in response to hot temperatures. So we're going to look at examples of some of that in a second. So the first word we're going to take a look at today is dormancy. So dormancy is simply a state of when an organism, a plant or an animal, when their physical functions are really slowed down or suspended. So they're temporarily inactive. A lot of times when we say the word dormancy, we automatically think of our plants and trees during the winter time. So for example, I have some pictures here. What do you guys notice about how this tree has changed over the seasons? And think about, can you even identify what seasons are being represented in this picture here? So look how the tree has changed from the spring to the summer, to the fall, and then to the winter time. So a lot of times our trees and plants during the winter time, in response to colder temperatures and in response to less sunlight, our plants and trees will go into dormancy. They start to, their leaves start to change colors. They will eventually fall from the ground, and it kind of looks like the tree is naked. It's lost all of its leaves. But sometimes people think, oh, the tree's dead or the plant's dead, but it's not really dead. The plant is just dormant. It's stopped growing. It's trying to conserve its energy to help it get through the winter time. Now, hopefully you've had time to step outside here lately, because a lot of our trees and plants are coming out of dormancy, and I've been seeing a lot of beautiful flowers outside. A good example of dormancy is this cool little plant here that you see on the left. It's called the Rose of Jericho. The real Rose of Jericho originally comes from Asia, but there is a false Rose of Jericho that can be found in the US, in the Chihuahuan Desert of the US and in Mexico. And it's super cool. It has a really cool adaptation in that it can remain dormant for a very long time. So when there's not a lot of water available and it's super hot, that little plant will curl up its leaves and form this really tight ball. And the wind will actually carry that ball, that little ball of a plant. The wind will carry it through the desert. And hopefully, eventually, over time, that wind will somehow carry it over to a body of water. And when that plant lands in a body of water, it's like it's resurrected. It comes to life once it finds that water source. So it's a very interesting plant with a very unique adaptation. So here on the bottom video, you can see it kind of rolls like a tumbleweed. So I thought that was a pretty cool plant. And then our next behavior is hibernation. So we talked about that word in the previous segment. Again, hibernation is just a form of dormancy, and it's a state of inactivity, particularly in our warm-blooded animals during the winter time. So it's important to note that there's different forms of hibernation, and they go through different degrees of changes within the body. Now, the true hibernators, they have a reduced metabolism, they have a super slow heart rate, and a lowered body temperature when they go through the true hibernation. So here we have some cute little pictures of an animal that goes through a true hibernation. And this is our little woodchuck friend, or our groundhog, as we call them. And they are true hibernators. So in the summer, to prepare for that winter hibernation, during the summertime, they start putting on as much weight as they can. So you can see this little fat guy over here. They start putting on as much weight as they can to store some of those fat reserves. And then hopefully by the time winter comes around, they've got enough food and fat reserves in their body to help them sustain themselves during that winter sleep or dormancy. Now, something cool about these little groundhogs here, when they go through hibernation, their body temperature drops a lot. So it's typically about 99 degrees Fahrenheit, but when they go into hibernation mode, it drops all the way down to 40 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's rather cold. And their heartbeat also changes too. So when they're active, their heartbeat's typically 100 beats per minute. But when they go into that hibernation mode, their heart only beats 4 times per minute. So that's a drastic change. So I thought that was pretty interesting with our little groundhog friends. Now, we said hibernation mostly relates to our warm-blooded animals during winter time. Now, we learned about estivation with Mrs. Fuller, and again, estivation is just that dormancy during the summertime when it tends to be hotter and drier. And it's usually relates to our reptile and our amphibian friends. And again, it's during the hot, dry summer times. So it's like a summertime sleep. And here's a cool looking, it's a fish actually. It's a cool fish called the African lungfish. And it's actually, scientists consider it a prehistoric fish because it's been around for over 400 million years. And they can do something really cool. They can dig a burrow, a little hole in the mud. And so if it's super hot and dry and their water source, their pond or lake or whatever they're living in, if it dries out, they will dig a hole in the mud and they will estivate or go into that summer-like sleep until the rains fill up their little habitat again. So here you can see a little picture of one of the burrows that they can dig, and they just keep themselves in that burrow, and they do something really interesting. They will secrete a mucus. It's like a slime cocoon all over their body. And that mucus that they release, that slime that they release, helps keep their body moist as they're going through that summertime sleep. And they can last in that sleep for months or years until that rainfall comes again. And then also our amphibians, our frogs and toads, some species will also estivate too. And then so think about how do animals prepare themselves for this long period of inactivity or sleep? So what are some things that they need to do before they even get to that stage? And as I said before, eating a lot prior and having their body store up those fat and energy reserves is a big important factor for them. The next behavior we're going to talk about is migration. And that simply means to move or travel from one place to another and then back again. So the way that I remember that is migrate starts with an M, move also starts with an M. So migrate just means to move. And particularly they're moving for long distances and they move for different reasons. So sometimes animals might move to another place to find warmth. They might move to another place to find water or better food. So depending upon the animal, they might be moving for different reasons. And to prepare animals for migration, again, they're going to have to store up those energy reserves. They're going to have to get as much food as they can. And some animals, like birds, will even have to exercise certain muscles to make sure that their body is prepared to undergo those long flights. And then a lot of our birds and flying insects that migrate on their migration route. So as they're flying, they can save energy by riding those air currents as well. And then an example of an animal that migrates would be the monarch butterflies. So I used to see a lot of them out here, but I haven't really seen a lot in the last few years. But something cool about our monarchs is, again, they also store fat reserves to help for migration, but they can also cluster in large colonies of thousands of butterflies, as you see over here. And by clustering together in those large colonies, that is helping them to stay warm. And something interesting, I told you guys earlier that I haven't really seen a lot of monarchs lately over the past few years. Their population numbers are in decline, and that's mostly due to habitat loss. So they're losing their main source of food, which is milkweed. So something that you guys can do either at school or at home is to plant a pollinator garden. So plant some flowers, particularly species of milkweed, which is this plant here, that these butterflies need to survive. And then again, as Ms. Nash mentioned earlier, if you're in Dallas ISD, you can actually order seeds from the center as well. And so another problem, and you can see the migration route. So they're moving south. So if you ever go to Mexico during their migration route, I'm pretty sure it's a beautiful sight to see. I've always wanted to go. So some of the populations of monarchs will fly south toward the winter, toward Mexico, where it's warmer. And then some populations will simply just move toward the California area again, and it's going to be warmer temperatures there. And then, so that's our example with monarchs, but can you think of other animals that also migrate and think about why do those animals migrate? And then I have a challenge question and an activity for you guys. So think about how can you help local animals prepare for hibernation or migration? And think about how can you help wildlife survive extreme heat or cold? So I know we had that crazy polar vortex last month, and I put out some bird feed. The first day I put it out, I filled up a whole big bird feeder, and by the end of the day, that bird feeder, all the food was totally gone. So I had birds constantly there all day. So think about how can we help these animals survive these extreme conditions. So here's an example of how you can make your own bird feeder just using a plastic water bottle. Again, just throw some seeds out and plant a garden. I like to feed the squirrels. My neighbor doesn't. He doesn't like the squirrel friends, but I like to feed the squirrels. I think they need food too. Or make things like a water dish or a bird bath to help create a good stopover or place for the animals to go. And then my last thing is just a little extra activity. Research other forms of dormancy and think about what makes each different. So I actually gave you some examples of other forms of dormancy that you can see here in the picture. So you can research or look these up on your own time. They're rather fascinating. And I will tell you, my most favorite one is this water bear or moss piglet. It's this super tiny microscopic animal that lives in the water. And again, it's super tiny, but this little guy has one of the coolest forms of dormancy. It's called cryptobiosis. It essentially turns itself into like a mummy, and you can see a picture of it right here. It curls up into this tight little ball, and it essentially dries its entire body out, and it can stay like that for decades. And then also something cool that I learned while I was doing research, scientists actually sent some of these little water bear creatures on a European space rocket for 10 days. And these organisms survived out in space. So they survived the cold, they survived an environment with no oxygen, and they were able to survive the radiation from the sun. And when that rocket came back, about 68% of these little organisms were still alive. So I found that super cool. So animals can do a lot of cool and crazy things to help them survive temperature changes. And I'm gonna go ahead and stop our screen share. And before I go, one of those words I had on my slide was brewmation. In the wild, animals like this guy here, the bearded dragon, they can go through brewmation, and it's just the reptile form of a hibernation. So they just get rather lazy during the winter time because it's too cold. So they don't go through a true sleep. So for reptiles, we call that kind of lazy phase during the winter time. We call that brewmation. And this is Spike, the bearded dragon. So that's all I have for you guys today on animal behaviors. We're going to give it back to Dr. Gorman, and he's going to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Ramirez. And Kara Mia, and I hope I pronounced that right, from Rosemont, asked, what is a den? Okay, I'm going to give you the dictionary definition. The definition of a den: it is the lair or shelter of a wild animal, especially a predatory mammal. Excuse me. It could be a hole in the ground. It could be a cave. It could even be under your house, as long as it's a good, safe, warm place for animals. Now I'm going to share my screen. During this virtual field trip, students identified the basic needs of plants and animals and identified factors in the environment, including temperature and precipitation, that affect growth and behavior such as migration, hibernation, and dormancy of living things. Ms. Nash told you about the basic needs of plants. Mr. Monroe covered the basic needs of animals. Ms. Fuller described environmental factors, and Ms. Ramirez went over behaviors. Thank you. Teachers, how did we do? If you would, go to www.tiny.cc/EEC feedback, fill out a short form and send it back to us. We certainly would appreciate it. Want you guys to have a great rest of the day. Get ready for that rain and storms tonight. But most importantly, guys, I want you to have a great life. Be well.